Hello, everyone. My name is Ieva. I'm an associate professor here in the Counseling and Educational Settings program at Rowan University. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about an overview of mental health awareness and really the importance of attending to the social emotional development of all students. And as educators, I truly believe this and kind of want to extend this message to you. I believe that we are all here for all of our students, and that in really order to attend to the needs of our students, that our wellness matters. And so we have a continuous commitment to ourselves to take care of ourselves, whatever that looks like from a wellness perspective. And that as educators, we'll always continue to learn and grow to meet the needs of our students through challenging times and what could be ever changing as we move forward. So with that being said, I kind of want to talk about where we were pre-pandemic. And we were in a mental health crisis prior to the hit of COVID-19. And so just to give you a little stats, prior to the pandemic, suicide was the second leading cause between 10 and 24-year-olds. Suicide had also tripled for ages 10 to 14 in the past decade. It increased 76% for our older teenagers between the ages of 14 and 19. And 1 in 5 children between the ages of 13 and 18 have a current mental health diagnosis. And keep in mind that these statistics are based on those that had access to mental health care. Add factors such as our LGBTQ plus students. LGBT teens are 6 times more likely to experience depression. And to add further to that, our homeless children and youth in population, 50% of them are at risk for anxiety and depression. And then recently, the CDC has reported that 1 in 64 students have been diagnosed on the autism spectrum. And I mention this because in the state of New Jersey, we're actually 1 in 32. We're the highest in the state, and there's multiple factors. But given that potential, 83% of those students who are diagnosed on the autism spectrum have a 83% chance of having a comorbid diagnosis, which includes mental health, specifically anxiety and depression. And so what we were seeing in schools at the time, and teachers would attribute to this, is they had seen an increase in anxiety, students on the spectrum in their particular classrooms, an increase of diagnosis in ADHD, a higher layer and level of depression, which ultimately in the classroom resulted as a decrease in executive functioning skills that I'll talk about, and a decrease in social skills and really being able to relate to one another. And what all of these have in common is that they're centered on neurodiversity and how they affect our students neurologically. And then the pandemic hit and COVID-19. And this is really what students began to feel. I want to talk about there's a continuum of students. And of those students, some were thriving. So I want to draw your attention to there were students who were already sitting in schools not doing well and potentially diagnosed with general anxiety disorder or social anxiety. And they felt, when we went to remote learning, felt relieved and happy and not as anxious. And really engaged and focused because it eliminated a lot of the barriers that existed for them while they were in school. And then we have a large contingency of students who have felt stressed, who are scared, or a reoccurring anxious feeling, sad, lonely and separated and isolated, depressed, and even this layer and level of feeling suffocating, particularly being in a smaller space with multiple people. And so we have this range of spectrum right now of students who are thriving and majority who are just surviving. And just surviving also doesn't allow this ability to kind of be open to everything that we are tasked with doing. And you yourself as an adult and as an educator or as a parent, may have been feeling some of these things as well. And so during this time, a lot of our students had new responsibilities at home. There were older children who ended up potentially taking care of their siblings. We have some students who are themselves essential workers and so have also had a role reversal with parents potentially who have lost jobs, and that the students went out and sought jobs, or they were already in positions of being essential workers. And in that case, school became kind of on the backside and the back burner. We have some from a coping mechanism who were action oriented. In the beginning, they were sewing masks, they were painting rocks, and currently, in light of our racial tensions happening within society, that there is a lot of protesting and signs and social media to add to the action oriented aspect during this particular time. We also have students who are really focused on academics because that is a coping skill that some children go to. And we have some who had no way or motivation to even address academics. And so they play video games or whatever potential interest they have in their household. But it's also to be clear, to add to this layer and mix, that some of our students are not able to go outside and so not have a layer and level of fresh air for a variety of reasons, safety for COVID. And there are some that are not being fed. And while we know our schools are offering while in session to our students and their families, families also are at fear for attending to be able to also pick up kind of the food in light of the pandemic, which adds another layer. And then some parents and family members themselves are essential workers. And what we've seen is that parents have separated from their children in order to keep their children safe. And so we've seen isolation from family from one another as a support structure. And then we have some students, just due to the nature of parents' jobs and what we're in, may not have a layer and level of supervision and or structure, which has also increased the exposure to unstable homes and abuse and substance abuse that could be going on for some students. And to add to that layer, there's a lot of loss. And I want to acknowledge there's a lot of loss of life for some of our students, and for you, could be our family members. It could be, classmates. It has been teachers, and the range continues as we continue to see this. And then from the loss of life, we've also a lot of intangible losses for students. And I say this because students also don't know how to name feelings and or words to put into this, but there really is those loss of rites of passages and milestones, similar to graduations and award ceremonies and some of those things you think of at the closure at the end of the year that people have looked forward to. There's been a loss of access to friends and really social isolation. And I say this, that this is a time period and a generation who grew up having technology and able to communicate with their friends, but it is a very different feeling, as you all know, being in person and being able to read someone in nonverbals and to really be able to feel from someone else. There's also this loss of access to safety. So school was a place and space that provided a structure or predictability, which we've also lost. But it's also the place and space where they know there were adults who cared, and there was the potential to have 2 meals a day. And when you lose that safety piece, you are automatically in what we call a survival mode and just trying to operate on a day-to-day basis without really being able to take into account all these other things that we are tasked with doing, and academics being one of them. We had students have a loss of comfort to where they are. They may not necessarily feel safe or have comfort in the particular scenarios in which they are asked to be during this time, during the pandemic. And then there's a loss of control. And that loss of control really can truly increase and intensify anxiety and what decisions people can make. And so simultaneously, we're kind of losing our freedom and loss of control on being able to make kind of those decisions. There is a loss of being able to check in with another human being that Even when a teacher said hello every morning or they got greeted by a bus driver, it became a structure and routine where it was another person that cared enough to say something to me. And we don't have those interactions, and the loss of those interactions also cause some turmoil for some of our students. And then there's this loss of risk taking. So part of growing up is that we try things out and we get re-educated, and so we take risks, and that's where a lot of our growth comes from, right? Is being in the ability to be able to take a risk. And so what our students are missing out on is our opportunities where that would be happening from an academic standpoint and from a social standpoint. And so as a result of that, there are missing some milestones that potentially could also lead to a loss of identity development. You know, some people define yourselves by what you do. So educators, right? We define ourselves in our profession as educators and another identity that you have. And some students, from an athletic standpoint, from an academic standpoint, from a social standpoint, and with friends, is how they identify. And when all those things are taken away, potentially, we also run the risk of the loss of identity development. And what this means is that there's a lot of grieving, right? So we had a mental health pandemic previously, and then we have the impact of COVID right now as I'm creating this, that also adds a layer of grief and loss, which can also increase tendencies of anxiety and that can also lead to depression. And I'm going to say this, well, statistically speaking, if we didn't attend to anxiety by third grade, it has the greatest potential to eventually turn into depression for students over periods of time. And for students, they don't necessarily recognize that what they're feeling, right, is a layer and level of anxiety. And so sometimes this has gone unnoticed. Right now, in the height of a pandemic, among multiple other crises that are going on, this is not something that we can necessarily hide anymore. And I think this picture, speaks volumes. And this was written by a 5-year-old that I found on social media. And it really is about their version of what they think COVID looks like. And it reads, "Go away, never come back. You scare me. I want you gone. You make me worry. I don't like you. You're mean. You're the worst. I hate you. Never come by again. Never come in my head again." And it also speaks to the consistent and constant worry that is also happening in our students' heads. And so one of the ways in which we are unable to explore right now is how students are internalizing. So if students aren't able to check in and they're not able to have conversations at school, or potentially because their parents are working, they're left with all of these mixed messages. And what happens is we internalize them. And so when we internalize them, there's this process of potential of what I'll call negative or faulty thinking that stick and stay as a result of the potential anxiety that someone's in. And therefore, really what is happening at this moment in time for all of our students across this country is that they are experiencing what we call an adverse childhood experience. And an adverse childhood experience that I'm going to attend to in the next couple of slides really has some short and long-term effects. And so the pandemic in and of itself as one of these experiences is what we would consider trauma. And also couple that with racial trauma currently and where we are. And so adverse childhood experiences used to be something we attended to, like child abuse, growing up in a house of a parent of an alcoholic. And people understood on some level that these were large events that ultimately could potentially cause trauma for students and then have long-standing effects. And now what we're saying is that this whole pandemic is also similar. But just to talk about previously, the impact of childhood trauma and why this is so important is because it affects all areas for students. It affects how we think, and whether or not we're going to have the ability to be able to learn and problem solve. It affects long-term physical health, sleeping, your immune system, and it is linked to a quicker death. It also impacts our emotions and how we're able to regulate them or to have coping skills and what our sensitivity looks like. And then this internalized shame and guilt. It also affects our relationships And realistically, are we able to build those relationships? And now in a virtual world, based on trust and being able to be intimate. We obviously affects our mental health, depression, anxiety, very low self-esteem, and on some level, a version of what we call post-traumatic stress disorder, and can also lead to suicide ideation. It also affects our behavior and how our actions outplay. So we could withdraw, we could have aggression, we could have poor impulse control when it comes to our bodies. We can really be acting out. Um, and then it also affects brain development. So the younger that this is happening, it does have the potential, adverse childhood experiences as a whole, to impair the development of the brain. And so these are really short term and mostly long-term effects that affect all of our students. So when you start hearing these words right now about as we potentially try to replan for going back into the school for fall of 2020, you'll hear a lot of places and spaces talk about everyone needs to be trauma informed. Everyone needs to understand what trauma is. And part of that rationale now is knowing we were already in a mental health crisis and everyone was moving in that direction, but now becomes the urgency and immediacy as a result of the pandemic. And just to kind of show you from a racial perspective, because I think this is really important to kind of point out to you that all of what I just presented on the other slide, from the time students experience it to all of these gaps that potentially happen that could ultimately lead to a physical early death, that there's a huge racial component of really generational trauma. It does actually rechange and code our DNA, right? And this social condition, and you can look on the side of this arrow that says microaggressions and implicit bias. And as students have had multiple of those, end up being adverse childhood experiences in which we call complex trauma. And so there's a layer and level for all children right now to experience a layer of trauma, but that is also particularly for our students of color who are now experiencing what we call complex trauma. And there is a lot of ways in which that can impair and affect all of the previous things that we just talked about, like their mental health behavior. And so it's important for everyone to realize that there has to be some sort of intervention or some sort of knowledge in school to be able to acknowledge this trauma, because here's how this trauma really affects students. So we talk about the word neurodiversity, and there are many diagnoses, both educational and medical, that are all chimed into our neurological system. And so ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia, right? Autism. What I like about this particular graphic is it actually highlights the strengths of some of these diagnoses. But what people often forget or understand is that mental health is a part of neurodiversity. It affects our ways of thinking, right? It affects the brain. And so if that's the case, then it also affects potentially the outcomes educationally and academic for our students, and social as well. And so when we used to talk about executive functioning, it really was talked about specifically in SST meetings, in relation really to ADHD, sometimes on the autism spectrum. And what is happening now as students are experiencing a layer of anxiety or a diagnosable layer of anxiety, depression, and or trauma, we ultimately find it really hard to really think and plan and to do all these actions that I'm going to break down for a moment. But think about yourself for a moment in this pandemic. Have you found yourself lost in time, or that it takes you longer to be able to do some of the things that used to take you a shorter amount of time? Or are you having trouble focusing? Because all of that is related, or have brain fog, right? All of that is related to executive functioning. What it really starts to address is that we have some trouble controlling emotions or impulses, right? So that can also be a physical act. It's really difficult right now to start anything, to have some sort of task initiation. You know, just because there's a folder online right now, it doesn't mean that I am actually literally able to have my brain tell my hand to be able to click on that button. That's what we call task initiation. It is also possible that we can't plan or prioritize. And so we can't organize and we can't plan and we can't prioritize, and school's not attending remotely or even in person to that, it's really hard to then be successful academically. It's also possible, almost impossible to multitask or to balance, or really even to solve problems as simple as what is it that I'm going to eat today? You know, how should I, like, what should I make for myself? And then on top of that, it's really hard to process new information, which also is also really hard in order to have some sort of flexible thinking. And all of these skills you see here embedded in executive function are tasks that we need to be academically ready and to be able to learn and to be able to produce what teachers are asking students to do. And so we have come to this place in space where there are multi-tiered systems that need to happen in order to intervene for students. And if you look at this particular diagram, there are multiple spokes of the wheel. And those spokes of the wheel in it of itself are their own professional developments on universal screening, on social emotional learning, how to use common language and expectations within your school, how to respond to help regulate emotional and physiological responses in students, restorative practices in lieu of disciplinary practices that have been typically happening in school settings, how to integrate and also collaborate with your community, understanding similarly on a small scale what we just talked about of understanding ACEs. There's a lot more information to know. And then also how to respond culturally and with culturally responsive pedagogy in light also of where we are too as we work through this process. And so I say this that I'm going to focus a little more on the ACEs and understanding trauma and what that looks like, and then also social emotional learning and how it fits into all these pieces. But social emotional learning becomes only one aspect and one part of really intervening from trauma and a mental health perspective. So the takeaway today is that we really kind of on a low level talked about mental health pre and post, and really it's not post, it's current pandemic. Kind of understand where we are as far as trauma is concerned, and that you do know that there are short and long-term effects, and that how mental health impairs academic readiness. So moving forward and following up this demo, we're really going to take a deep dive into mental health awareness and specific aspects and systems behaviors and what that looks like. And then also the roadblocks and challenges coming into school with mental health simultaneously. We're going to look at a little deeper dive into the rationale and overview of trauma-informed practices and really what that means, but specifically focusing on the ACEs model, adverse childhood experiences and trauma, and specifically social emotional learning. And then how to combine all of that together to kind of come with how we build emotionally safe classrooms, use strength-based communication in conjunction with social emotional learning. And so for me, it looks like this, that after our professional development workshop, that you'll understand what that emotionally safe classroom looks like and how to get there and strategies, and then ultimately how to communicate with your students on a more emotional level and being able to validate, and then how to create really social emotional objectives and ways in which to empower executive functioning alongside visual supports, and then your actual content that you as educators are providing. And so that we can ensure that there's that we reach students' potential successes. And with that, I look forward to seeing you at a later date and time. I appreciate it.